That's a big one, and it's tough to do. With a lot of it is like having good parts and having good parts availability and people and having some of that infrastructure on site. But really.
He was 5 years old the first time he sat behind the controls of heavy machinery. Not a toy, not a simulator, a real piece of equipment on a real gold claim in the Alaskan wilderness. Today, that same person owns one of the largest private placer mining operations in the Yukon, has pulled more than $50 million worth of gold out of the ground over the course of his career, and just gambled $15 million on a single stretch of frozen creek bed most people had written off as mined out a century ago. This is the story of Parker Schnabel, not the polished version you see in a 42-minute television edit, but the fuller picture of how a kid from a town of 1,700 people became one of the wealthiest young men in reality TV, and why, even now, he still doesn't act like it. Parker Russell Schnabel was born on July 22, 1994, in Haines, Alaska, a small coastal town tucked between glaciers and fjords in the state's southeastern panhandle. Haines is not the kind of place that produces many millionaires. It's a fishing and logging community, isolated by mountains on one side and water on the other, where the population hovers around 1,700 people, and the nearest city of any real size is a ferry ride away. Winters are long and brutal. Summers are short and precious. If a machine breaks, there's no repair shop around the corner. You fix it yourself, or it doesn't get fixed. That environment shaped Parker before he ever understood what wealth even meant. His grandfather, John Schnabel, was the reason gold mining entered the family's life at all, and it happened almost by accident. John wasn't born into mining. He grew up on a Kansas wheat farm during the Great Depression, spent time as a young man skirting the edges of the law before making his way to Alaska, and later served in the Army Air Corps during World War II. He eventually settled in Haines, married, raised 5 children, and lived an ordinary working life until his late 60s, when a heart problem changed everything. After undergoing triple bypass surgery, doctors told him he needed to stay active. So at 68 years old, in 1984, John Schnabel bought a claim at Porcupine Creek that would come to be known as the Big Nugget Mine. What began as doctor's orders turned into a genuine second career, and eventually a family legacy. Parker spent his childhood summers there at his grandfather's side, learning to run the same loaders and dozers most kids his age had never even seen up close. There was no script to it, no lesson plan, just a grandfather who believed the best way to teach was to let a child do the real thing under supervision, not a scaled-down version of it. While his peers were still learning to ride bikes without training wheels, Parker was already comfortable behind the wheel of equipment worth more than most houses. It wasn't indulgence. It was preparation, whether anyone intended it that way or not. Discovery's Gold Rush premiered in 2010, built initially around a group of laid-off Oregon workers chasing gold in the Yukon. But the show's producers also found their way to Haines and to the Big Nugget Mine, where John Schnabel's operation, and his young grandson working alongside him, became part of the story from the show's early seasons. Parker was a teenager when cameras first started following him, quiet and unproven, easy to overlook next to more seasoned, camera-ready personalities. Nobody was certain a teenage crew member could carry any real weight on a show about grown men fighting brutal terrain for a living. Then, during the show's second season, something happened that reshaped the entire trajectory of Parker's life. His grandfather, given his advancing age and health, made the decision to step back and hand control of Big Nugget Mine to his 16-year-old grandson. It wasn't a ceremonial gesture. Parker was now the one responsible for running an actual mining operation, managing a crew, keeping machinery working, and making sure the mine actually produced. For a boy who hadn't yet finished high school, it was an enormous weight to carry, and it happened in front of a national television audience. Around that same time, Parker made a decision that stunned his family and later stunned viewers. Instead of using the money set aside for his college education, he poured it into his mining operation and, eventually, into leasing new ground of his own. It wasn't a small, symbolic use of savings. It was a full wager on the idea that hands-on experience and hard ground could do more for his future than a university degree could. It was a decision built on confidence earned the hard way, not naivety, and it set the tone for how Parker Schnabel would operate for the next decade. Aggressive, self-directed, and willing to risk what other people would consider unthinkable to risk. John Schnabel remained a guiding presence in Parker's life well after handing over the mine, appearing on the show as an elder statesman of the operation, someone Parker could still lean on for advice even after taking the reins. But John's health continued to decline, and on March 18, 2016, he passed away in his sleep at the age of 96. He had lived through the Depression, a world war, a heart surgery that was supposed to slow him down, but instead launched an entirely new chapter of his life, and had built, almost by accident, the foundation of what would become his grandson's fortune. For Parker, the loss was deeply personal, not just professional. John hadn't only handed him a mine, he'd handed him a way of thinking about work, risk, and responsibility. Parker paid tribute to him publicly at the time, describing him as a man who had lived a remarkable life and who deserved to be remembered as one of a kind. The family, in a joint statement, called him irreplaceable as a father, grandfather, and overall presence in their lives. What Parker carried forward from that loss wasn't just grief. It was the responsibility of proving that everything his grandfather built could keep growing, even without him there to guide it directly. By his late teens, Parker had already left Big Nugget behind to strike out on his own in the Klondike region of Canada's Yukon, leasing ground from one of the most respected and most intimidating figures in the mining world. Tony Beets, a Dutch-born miner who had built one of the largest and most successful operations in the region and had become known to viewers as one of the toughest personalities on the show. The deal Parker struck with Beets in those early years was not generous. As Parker's production increased, so did the royalty percentage he owed on the gold he pulled from Beets' ground, eventually climbing high enough that by his own account, continuing to mine past a certain point would have put him at risk of losing money rather than making it. That arrangement created real friction between the two men over the following seasons, playing out publicly on camera as their relationship shifted from mentorship to rivalry. Beets, for his part, never hid his skepticism about Parker's approach, at times publicly questioning whether the younger miner was overextending himself by running multiple operations at once. But the tension between them was never purely adversarial. It was two ambitious, stubborn people with very different mining philosophies, working the same region and occasionally colliding over it. Over time, that rivalry became one of the more compelling ongoing threads of the show, and by the show's later seasons, it had settled into something closer to grudging mutual respect. Two of the most successful independent operators in the Yukon still competing, but no longer strangers to each other's grit. Parker's other major on-screen rivalry, with fellow miner Todd Hoffman, followed a different arc entirely. Where the tension with Beets was rooted in a business relationship, the friction with Hoffman was more generational, a clash between an older miner who valued experience and tradition, and a younger one who was rapidly outproducing him through efficiency and calculated risk-taking. As Parker's operation grew more successful season after season, Hoffman struggled by comparison, and the pressure of that ongoing comparison became part of what ultimately led Hoffman to step away from the main series in 2018, later returning in a spin-off built around his own family's operation. It wasn't a rivalry built on personal cruelty so much as an uncomfortable, very public illustration of two very different approaches to the same brutal profession, and only one of them was working. By the time Parker was 24, his operation had produced gold worth more than $13 million over the course of his young career, a figure that alone would have made him one of the most successful people his age in almost any industry, let alone one as unpredictable as placer gold mining. That number has continued to climb in the years since. Across the full run of the show, his operation's total gold production is now estimated at well over $50 million, with some individual seasons boosted by historically high gold prices, bringing in production valued at over $18 million in a single year. Parker's television compensation grew right alongside his mining success. In the show's early years, his per-episode pay was modest by celebrity standards. As his profile and the stakes of his storylines grew, so did his rate, eventually reaching figures reported in the tens of thousands of dollars per episode. It's meaningful money, But it's worth being honest about the scale here. Parker's fortune was never primarily built by a television paycheck. It was built underground, ounce by ounce, season after season, in some of the most physically demanding conditions imaginable. Estimating his current net worth is inherently imprecise. Placer mining income fluctuates wildly with gold prices, operating costs, and how much of a season's production actually clears expenses. But most financial estimates place Parker's net worth somewhere in the range of $8 to $15 million in liquid terms. That's a wide range, and deliberately so, because unlike a salaried celebrity, Parker's wealth is tied up in equipment, land, and gold still sitting underground rather than in a static bank balance. Some estimates go further, pointing to the untapped gold reserves believed to sit beneath his current claims, potentially worth well over $100 million if it can all be extracted, as a measure of his long-term potential rather than his present-day cash worth. If there's one decision that defines the current chapter of Parker's career, it's Dominion Creek. In 2023, at 28 years old, Parker paid approximately $15 million for a large block of placer claims on Dominion Creek in the Yukon. Reportedly, the single largest land acquisition in the show's history, and one of the biggest private placer purchases the modern Klondike had seen in years. The ground had been mined more than a century earlier during the original Klondike gold rush, but Parker and his team believed it still held somewhere in the neighborhood of 80,000 recoverable ounces of gold, a figure that, depending on gold prices, could represent well over $160 million sitting in the ground. It was, by any measure, an enormous gamble. The gold sat deep, reportedly around 40 feet below the surface in places, meaning extraction would require heavy upfront investment in equipment and labor before a single ounce came out. Parker's licensing terms required him to hit demanding annual production targets over a multi-year window just to make the math work, and the early going was rough. Equipment failures, permitting delays, and difficult frozen ground slowed his crews far below the pace he needed. He's spoken candidly in interviews about the pressure that came with the purchase, describing the period after buying Dominion as one defined by a hard timeline and very little room for error, with the size of the upfront investment weighing on every decision that followed. Rather than retreat, Parker doubled down, reinvesting further into infrastructure, pumps, and additional claims to try to accelerate production. It's a kind of decision that could either cement his legacy as one of the boldest operators in modern placer mining, or become the costliest mistake of his career. And as of the show's most recent seasons, that story is still being written in real time, with Dominion Creek now running multiple wash plants and standing as the centerpiece of his entire operation. Here's the part of Parker's story that tends to surprise people the most. For someone whose operation has produced tens of millions of dollars in gold, his personal lifestyle is remarkably restrained. He has said directly in more than one interview that he doesn't spend much on physical possessions. There's no mansion, no supercar collection, no rotating cast of luxury properties splashed across his social media. Most of what his operation earns gets reinvested straight back into the business. Better equipment, more ground, a larger and more capable crew. His home base remains in Haines, Alaska, the same small town where his story started. Public property records and reporting describe a modest house, roughly 2,000 square feet, sitting on a stretch of land near Porcupine Creek, not far from where his grandfather's original claim was located. It's a practical property, not an ostentatious one. Solar panels, a backup generator, the kind of self-sufficient setup that makes sense for someone who understands, better than most, what it means to be far from convenient repairs when something breaks. Some reporting has suggested he holds additional property interests in the Yukon as well, tied to the scale of his mining operations there, though, consistent with how private he's generally been about his personal finances. He hasn't laid out the full picture publicly. Where his money does show up more visibly is in the equipment and vehicles tied to his operation, trucks, all-terrain vehicles, and machinery built for rugged, demanding terrain rather than showroom appeal. It's wealth expressed through utility, not display. And when Parker does choose to spend on himself and the people around him, it tends to go toward experiences rather than possessions. Trips with his crew, time with family, the kind of memories he said matter more to him than material things ever could. It's a mindset that stands out sharply against the usual reality TV playbook, where sudden wealth so often gets converted immediately into visible status symbols. Parker's income has never come from a single source, even if mining remains the foundation of everything else. Alongside his television earnings, he's built out a merchandise line tied to his personal brand, offering clothing and related products to the large audience that's followed his career since he was a teenager. He's also opened his original family claim near Haines to visitors, offering gold panning tours that let fans experience, in a small way, the same ground where his story began. And his ambitions have started to extend beyond Alaska and the Yukon altogether. Recent seasons of his companion series have followed him exploring gold-rich regions in Australia and even visiting Serra Pelada in Brazil, one of the most storied gold mining sites in the world, as he looks for ways to apply his experience on a broader stage. None of these additional ventures come close to matching what his core mining operation generates, but together they reflect something consistent about how Parker approaches money. He treats it as a tool for expanding what he's already building, not as a means to a flashier lifestyle. It's an instinct that traces directly back to his grandfather's example: reinvest, expand, and let the operation itself be the real asset, rather than whatever it can buy you personally in the short term. For someone who has spent more than a decade on television, Parker has managed to keep an unusually tight lid on his personal relationships. The most publicly documented relationship of his life was with Ashley Yule, an Australian veterinary nurse he met in 2016 while filming in Australia. He invited her to join him in the Klondike, and for a period of roughly 2 years, she was genuinely part of his operation, working in the gold room, contributing to the crew rather than simply appearing as a girlfriend in the background of episodes. Their relationship ended in 2018, and Parker has spoken about it with more candor than he typically extends to his personal life, describing the breakup as one of his real regrets and acknowledging that the demands of his work made it difficult to give the relationship the priority it deserved. Yule, for her part, has never spoken publicly about the relationship or its end, largely stepping back from public attention afterward. In the years since, Parker's name has occasionally been linked to other women, including, briefly, a British television industry professional in 2018, but nothing has ever been confirmed, and Parker has generally declined to discuss his personal life in any real detail. He's described his own approach to work in interviews as something close to workaholic, acknowledging that mining tends to take precedence over most everything else in his life, relationships included. Whether that's a byproduct of losing so many formative years to a demanding operation at such a young age or simply a genuine personal preference,